She knocked on his cabin at 2 a.m. "Please don't light the lantern. They'll see us." The mountains were silent that night. Not the peaceful silence of a calm winter evening, but the deep, heavy stillness that comes when snow falls thick and slow across the high country, the kind that swallowed every sound, even the wind. Ethan Walker sat alone beside the small iron stove in his cabin, staring into the orange glow of the fire. Outside, the snow had already climbed halfway up the fence posts. The storm had come down from the northern ridges just before dusk, rolling across the timber like a white curtain. He had seen worse storms in these mountains, but not many. Ethan lifted a tin cup of black coffee and took a slow drink. Across the room, his rifle leaned against the wall beside the door. Habit. A man living alone this far from town learned to keep a rifle close. The clock on the shelf ticked softly. 2 o'clock in the morning. Most men in these mountains would be asleep by now. But Ethan rarely slept long, not since the shooting in Cheyenne 6 years earlier. Some memories had a way of waking a man long before dawn. The fire popped, a log shifted, and then, knock. Ethan's head lifted. He stayed perfectly still. For a moment he thought it might have been the wind pushing snow against the door. Then it came again. Knock, knock, soft, urgent. His hand moved slowly toward the rifle. Nobody visited cabins in these mountains at 2 in the morning, not in winter, not in a storm. Ethan stood quietly and crossed the wooden floor. Another knock came, this one weaker, almost desperate. He reached the door and rested one hand against the rough pine. The cold from outside seeped through the wood. For a long moment he listened. Nothing, just snow whispering against the roof. Then, a woman's voice, a woman's, barely louder than the storm. "Please." Ethan frowned. "Please open the door." He unlatched the bolt and pulled the door inward. A rush of cold air spilled into the cabin. Snow swirled across the floor. And standing in the doorway was a woman wrapped in a heavy wool coat, dusted white with snow. Her hair was frozen in strands along her cheeks. Her breath came in quick clouds. 2 children clung tightly to her coat. A small girl no older than 6, and a boy maybe 8. Their faces were pale with cold. The boy looked up at Ethan with wide eyes. The woman stepped quickly inside and shut the door behind them. For a moment none of them spoke. The little girl buried her face against the woman's side. The boy shivered violently. Ethan studied them carefully. Their boots were caked with snow, their clothes thin for mountain weather. Travelers, but not prepared ones. He walked to the small table and reached for the oil lantern sitting there. The cabin was dim, lit only by the stove. "Hold on," he said. "I'll get some light." The woman's hand shot forward suddenly. Her voice came out in a whisper sharp with fear. "Please, don't light it." Ethan stopped. The room fell still again. Snow tapped softly against the window. The woman's eyes moved toward the dark forest outside, and then back to him. Her voice trembled. "They'll see us." Ethan's brow tightened. "Who will?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she knelt and wrapped her arms around the 2 children, pulling them close as if shielding them from something unseen. The boy spoke quietly. "Ma, are they coming?" The woman forced a small smile for him. "No, Samuel, not yet." Then she looked back at Ethan, and for the first time he saw something deeper than exhaustion in her eyes. Pure fear. The kind a man only saw in people being hunted. Ethan slowly lowered his hand from the lantern. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to glance outside. The storm had thickened. Snow moved across the dark trees like drifting smoke. Nothing moved. No lanterns. No riders. Just endless winter night. Behind him the woman spoke again. "They're looking for us." Ethan turned. "Who?" Her answer came quietly. "Men who don't intend to let us live." The stove crackled. The children huddled together beside their mother. Ethan studied them for a long moment. Then he walked slowly back toward the table. "Start talking," he said. The woman hesitated. Then she took a breath. "My name is Mary Caldwell." Her hand rested on the boy's shoulder. "This is Samuel. And Lucy." Ethan nodded once. "And the men chasing you?" Mary swallowed. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. They killed my husband 3 days ago. The room went silent. Outside, the storm continued to fall, but somewhere beyond the trees, far down the mountain trail, a faint sound drifted through the night, the distant echo of horses, and Ethan Walker realized the quiet life he had built in this cabin was about to end. Ethan Walker stood near the window, listening. At first, the storm swallowed everything. The wind carried snow against the cabin walls in long, sweeping breaths. Pine trees creaked under the weight of ice. But after a moment, the sound came again, faint, distant, hoofbeats, slow, careful. Ethan let the curtain fall back into place. Behind him, Mary Caldwell watched his face. "Did you hear them?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and crouched near the stove where the children were warming their hands. Samuel's teeth chattered despite the heat. Lucy's small fingers clutched the sleeve of her mother's coat. They looked half frozen. Ethan reached for the kettle resting near the stove and poured warm water into a tin cup. "Drink," he said, handing it to the boy. Samuel nodded gratefully. Mary watched Ethan carefully, as if trying to measure what kind of man he was. Most men in the territory would already have pushed them back out into the storm. Trouble had a way of following strangers, but Ethan hadn't asked them to leave. Not yet. Finally, he spoke. "How far behind you are they?" Mary hesitated. "An hour when we left the road," she said. "Maybe less now." Ethan leaned back slightly. "In this snow, they won't move fast." "They don't have to." Her voice carried a strange certainty. "They know where we're going." That made Ethan look at her again. "You headed somewhere?" Mary nodded slowly. "Silver Creek." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "That town's 30 miles from here." "I know." "With 2 children?" She swallowed. "We didn't have another choice." Ethan studied her boots. Thin leather, cracked soles. They had been walking a long time. Too long for this weather. "You weren't planning to stop here," he said. Mary shook her head. "No." "Then how'd you find this cabin?" She gestured toward the window. "We saw smoke from the ridge." Ethan glanced toward the stovepipe rising through the roof. A careless mistake. He hadn't thought anyone would be traveling tonight. Samuel suddenly looked up from the cup. "Ma," he whispered. Mary touched his hair. "It's all right." But Ethan could see the boy's eyes drifting toward the door, toward the dark outside. Children understood danger better than most grown men. Ethan stood again and walked to the wooden rack beside the door. 2 rifles hung there, one long Winchester, one older hunting rifle. He checked the Winchester first. Loaded. Always. Mary watched him closely. "You're going to help us?" she asked quietly. Ethan turned the rifle over in his hands. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On why those men want you dead." The words hung heavily in the room. Mary looked down at her children. Lucy had fallen asleep against her coat. Samuel leaned against the stove, exhausted. Mary gently guided them toward the small bed against the wall. "Lie down," she whispered. Samuel hesitated. "But what if they won't come inside?" Her voice carried the kind of promise only a mother could make. The boy finally lay down beside his sister. Within minutes, both children drifted into uneasy sleep. Mary pulled a wool blanket over them. Then she turned back to Ethan. The fear in her eyes had changed now, still frightened, but also determined. She stepped closer and reached slowly into the inside pocket of her coat. Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle, but she only pulled out a folded bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the table, carefully. "Those men hunting us," she said quietly, "aren't robbers." Ethan said nothing. Mary unfolded the cloth. Inside were several papers, official-looking, stamped with dark ink seals, land documents, property records. But Ethan noticed something else. Several pages carried signatures, and names he recognized. Railroad men, powerful ones. Mary spoke again. "My husband worked for the railroad company surveying land west of Silver Creek." Ethan nodded slowly. "Lots of men do." "Yes." Her voice trembled slightly. "But he found something he wasn't supposed to." Ethan waited. Mary pointed at one of the documents. These lands were taken from homesteaders illegally. Ethan frowned. That happens plenty, but that's not the worst of it. She slid another paper across the table. A death report. Several names listed: farmers, ranchers, men who had refused to sell their land. Mary's voice grew quiet. They didn't just steal the land. Ethan's jaw tightened. They killed the men who owned it. The stove popped sharply behind them. Ethan looked at the papers again. He recognized one of the signatures, a railroad investor from Denver, a man rich enough to buy judges. "So your husband found this?" Ethan said slowly. Mary nodded. "He copied the records before they destroyed them." "What happened next?" Her eyes filled with quiet grief. "They came to our house 3 nights ago." The words felt heavy in the air. "They asked my husband where the papers were." Ethan already knew the answer. "He wouldn't tell them." Mary shook her head. "He told me to run with the children." She paused. Her voice broke slightly. "And then they shot him in the yard." The cabin fell silent. The fire crackled softly. Ethan stared down at the documents. Now he understood. This wasn't just a hunted family. This was evidence. Evidence powerful men would kill to erase. He looked up. "And Silver Creek? There's a federal marshal stationed there. You sure about that?" "Yes." "If these papers reach him," Mary finished the thought, "the men behind this could hang." Ethan leaned back against the wall. For a long moment he said nothing. Helping her meant more than hiding strangers. It meant stepping into a war with men who had money, guns, and influence. Men who wouldn't stop until the papers were gone. Outside, the wind shifted, and through the storm, the sound came again. Hoofbeats, closer this time. Mary's head lifted instantly. Ethan walked slowly to the window again and pulled the curtain aside. At first he saw nothing but snow. Then, a flicker of orange light moving through the trees. A lantern. Another appeared behind it. Then a third. Riders. 5. Maybe 6. Moving slowly along the trail below the cabin. Searching. Ethan let the curtain fall. Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "They found us." Ethan walked to the rack and lifted the second rifle down. Then he blew out the small candle near the stove. The cabin sank into darkness except for the faint glow of coals. He looked at Mary. "You were right about one thing." "What?" He handed her the rifle. They'd see the lantern. Outside, the riders began climbing the hill toward the cabin. The riders moved like shadows through the storm. From the small window of the cabin, Ethan Walker watched the faint glow of their lanterns drift slowly up the slope below the trees. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Men who hunted for a living knew patience was often the sharpest weapon. Behind Ethan, Mary stood near the table, gripping the rifle he had given her. Her knuckles were pale. "You think they saw the smoke?" she whispered. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No." "Then how did they—" "They're tracking." Mary fell silent. Of course they were. Even in a snowstorm, good trackers could follow broken brush, disturbed snow, bent grass beneath the drifts, and Mary and the children had been running for miles. Ethan slowly stepped away from the window. The glow of the riders' lanterns faded behind the curtain. "How many?" Mary asked. 6. Her shoulders sank slightly. "That many?" "They won't all come up here at once," Ethan said quietly. "You're sure?" "No." The honesty hung heavily between them. Mary glanced toward the bed where Samuel and Lucy slept beneath the wool blanket. Lucy stirred faintly, turning her face into the pillow. Samuel opened his eyes for a moment. "Ma." "I'm here," Mary whispered. The boy looked toward Ethan. "Are the men outside?" Ethan knelt beside the bed. "Not yet," he said. Samuel studied his face carefully, as if trying to judge the truth of the words. Children were good at that, better than most adults. "Will they come?" the boy asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden horse. He held it out. Samuel's eyes widened slightly. "Where'd you get that?" "Made it a long time ago." Samuel took the little toy carefully. For a moment he forgot the fear. Lucy stirred again and curled closer to her brother. Ethan stood. Mary watched him with quiet confusion. "You carry toys in your pocket?" Ethan shrugged slightly. "Sometimes a man doesn't know when he'll need one." Mary didn't press further. Outside, the wind shifted. The sound of horses grew clearer now, leather creaking, snow crunching beneath hooves. The riders had reached the tree line below the cabin. Ethan moved toward the back wall and lifted a floorboard near the stove. Mary stared. Beneath the board was a small, hidden space. Inside lay 2 boxes of rifle cartridges and a revolver. He handed Mary several rounds. "Know how to shoot?" "My husband taught me." "Good." He replaced the board and stood. "Listen carefully." Mary nodded. "If they knock, you don't answer." "What if they break the door?" "They won't." "How do you know?" Ethan looked toward the window again. "Men like these don't kick down doors unless they're sure who's inside." He walked to the back of the cabin and opened a narrow wooden shutter. Cold air rushed in. Beyond the small opening stretched the dark forest behind the cabin. A narrow trail led deeper into the mountains. "You take the children and go out that way if I tell you," he said. Mary's eyes widened. "You're staying?" "Someone has to slow them down." Her voice tightened. "They'll kill you." "Maybe." Mary stepped closer. "You don't even know us." Ethan's expression remained calm. "I know enough." She looked down at the papers still resting on the table. "They're worth killing for." "Exactly." Outside, a horse snorted loudly. Then came the sound of a man's voice drifting through the snow. "Cabin up ahead." Mary froze. The riders had reached the clearing. Ethan moved quickly and extinguished the stove lamp completely, leaving only faint red coals glowing. The cabin plunged into near darkness. They waited. Seconds stretched. Then, crunch, boots in the snow. A shadow passed across the frosted window. Someone was walking around the cabin, checking, searching. Mary's breathing became shallow. Ethan raised a finger gently to his lips. Silence. Another shadow appeared at the door. Then came a heavy knock. Not desperate, not polite. A man's voice followed. "Evening inside." No one answered. The man knocked again, harder this time. "We saw your chimney smoke earlier today." Ethan remained perfectly still. Mary held the rifle tightly. Outside, another voice spoke. "Tracks come straight here." The first man chuckled softly. "Well now." He leaned closer to the door. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who enjoyed the hunt. "We ain't looking for trouble," he called. "Just a woman and 2 children passing through." Mary's heart pounded so loudly she was certain they could hear it. The man continued, "If you're hiding them in there, we'd appreciate your cooperation." Ethan slowly stepped closer to the door. Mary's eyes widened. He spoke calmly through the wood. "You got the wrong place." A pause, then quiet laughter outside. "Oh, I doubt that." The voice was familiar somehow. Ethan's brow tightened slightly. The man continued, "Now I don't want to damage your nice little cabin." Another pause. "But I will if I have to." Mary's hands trembled around the rifle. Ethan leaned closer to the door. "Who's asking?" For several seconds there was only wind. Then the man spoke again, and the moment the name left his mouth, Ethan felt an old memory rise like a ghost from the past. Silas Brogan. Mary didn't recognize the name, but Ethan did. Very well. 6 years earlier in Cheyenne, Ethan Walker had been a deputy marshal, and Silas Brogan had been the most dangerous outlaw in Wyoming territory. Ethan had been the one who arrested him. The silence outside broke with a slow, amused chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned," Brogan said. "Didn't expect to find you out here, Walker." Mary looked at Ethan in shock. "You know him?" Ethan didn't answer. Outside, Brogan's voice grew darker. "I suppose that explains why the door's still shut." A moment later, the sound of several rifles being cocked echoed through the storm. Brogan spoke again. "Tell you what, Walker, His voice carried deadly patience. "You hand over the woman and the kids, and we might just ride away." Inside the cabin, Mary realized something terrifying. The men hunting her had just found the one man in the mountains who might actually fight them, and the night was far from over. Snow drifted against the cabin walls as the men outside shifted their horses in the dark. Inside, the small room felt even smaller. Mary Caldwell stood near the table gripping the rifle Ethan had given her, her eyes wide with the realization settling in her chest. The man outside the door was not just another hired gun. He was someone Ethan Walker had once put behind bars. And men like that did not forget. Ethan stood beside the door, his voice calm when he answered. "You still talk too much, Brogan." Outside, Silas Brogan laughed quietly. The sound carried easily through the frozen air. "Well now, that's the Walker I remember." Boots crunched in the snow as he moved closer to the door. Mary could see Ethan's expression in the faint red glow from the stove coals. It had changed. The quiet trapper was gone. In his place stood something harder, something older, a man who had worn a badge. Brogan spoke again. "You know how this ends, Walker." Ethan didn't answer. "You've got 6 rifles pointed at that cabin. You've got a woman who ain't yours. And you've got papers that powerful men are paying real money to make disappear." A pause. Seems like poor odds for a retired lawman. Mary's breathing quickened. Ethan spoke through the door again. "You planning to stand out there talking all night?" Brogan chuckled. "Thought about it." Then his tone turned colder. "But the storm's getting worse." A rifle bolt clicked outside. "So here's the deal." Mary felt Samuel stir behind her on the bed. Lucy whimpered softly in her sleep. Brogan continued. "You hand over the woman and the children, and we ride away." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not happening." A long silence followed. Then Brogan sighed. "Well, I had a feeling you'd say that." Boots crunched in the snow as the men outside spread out around the cabin. Ethan stepped away from the door. "They're moving," he whispered. Mary swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Ethan walked to the window again, lifting the curtain just a fraction. Shadows moved between the trees. Lantern light flickered across the clearing. "They'll try the windows first," he said quietly. Mary's voice trembled. "They'll kill us." Ethan turned toward her. "No." His tone was calm, certain. "They'll try." Outside, a rifle cracked. The sound exploded through the night. The cabin window shattered as a bullet tore through the glass. Mary ducked instinctively. Samuel cried out. Ethan moved instantly. He fired the Winchester through the broken window. The sharp report echoed through the storm. A horse screamed outside. One of the riders cursed loudly. "Damn it, he hit Jackson!" Brogan's voice cut through the chaos. "Spread out!" More gunfire erupted. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls. Wood splintered. Mary pulled the children from the bed and dragged them to the floor beside the stove. Samuel clutched the little wooden horse Ethan had given him earlier. "Ma!" he cried. "It's all right," she whispered, though her voice shook. Across the room, Ethan reloaded the rifle with quick, practiced movements. Another shot came from outside. A bullet tore through the doorframe. Ethan leaned against the wall and fired again. A man outside shouted. The gunfight continued for several long seconds. Then suddenly, silence. Only the storm remained, snow drifting, wind whispering through the shattered window. Mary looked at Ethan. "Did they leave?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "No." Outside, Brogan's voice returned, louder now. "You always were stubborn, Walker." A moment later, something struck the side of the cabin. Heavy. Wood creaked under the impact. Mary's eyes widened. "What was that?" Ethan moved toward the back wall again. Through the cracks in the boards, he saw shadows dragging something through the snow. His stomach tightened. "Logs," he said. Mary frowned. "Why?" Ethan's voice grew grim. "They're building a barricade." Outside, the men worked quickly. Within minutes, several thick logs were stacked against the front of the cabin. Mary stared at Ethan in confusion. "Why would they do that?" Ethan looked toward the shattered window, toward the lantern light flickering in the clearing. Then realization hit him. Because they don't want us getting out. Mary's voice barely came out. What are they going to do? Outside, Brogan called out again. You remember that old mine outside Cheyenne, Walker? Ethan's jaw tightened. I remember. We smoked you out of there with fire. Mary felt her stomach drop. Ethan's eyes moved slowly toward the stove, toward the dry wooden walls of the cabin. Outside, the sound of a bottle breaking echoed through the clearing. The sharp smell of kerosene drifted through the shattered window. Mary whispered in horror. They're going to burn the cabin. Ethan's voice was steady. Yes. Samuel began to cry softly. Lucy clung to her mother. Mary looked at Ethan desperately. What do we do? For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm. Outside, the men prepared their torches. Finally, Ethan spoke. You and the children go out the back. Mary shook her head immediately. They'll see us. Not if they're watching the front. And you? Ethan picked up the Winchester again. I'll give them something else to look at. Mary stepped closer. You'll die. Ethan gave a faint smile. Not tonight. Outside, a torch flared to life. Its orange glow lit the falling snow. Silas Brogan stepped into the clearing holding the burning brand. He raised his voice. Last chance, Walker. Inside the cabin, Ethan pulled open the back shutter. Cold air rushed in. The dark forest waited beyond. He turned to Mary. Take the children. She hesitated only a moment. Then she lifted Lucy and grabbed Samuel's hand. Snow blew through the open shutter. Ethan checked the rifle one last time. Outside, Brogan walked slowly toward the cabin wall with the torch. The flame crackled loudly in the wind. Ethan stepped towards the door. Mary looked back once from the open shutter. Ethan. He didn't turn around. Go. And as Mary slipped into the dark forest with the children, Ethan Walker opened the cabin door and stepped out into the storm, directly into the circle of rifles waiting for him. Ethan Walker stepped out into the storm. The cold bit through his coat instantly, but he barely felt it. 6 rifles pointed at him from the clearing. Lantern light flickered across the snow, casting long shadows over the frozen ground. Silas Brogan stood a few yards away, holding the burning torch, the flame snapping in the wind. For a long moment no one moved. Then Brogan smiled. Well now, he said, lowering the torch slightly. Look who finally stepped outside. Ethan stood calmly, the Winchester resting loosely in his hands. Evening, Brogan. Brogan laughed softly. You always did have a way of making trouble for yourself. His eyes moved past Ethan briefly toward the cabin. You alone in there? Ethan shrugged. You see anyone else? Brogan studied him carefully. The outlaw's sharp eyes scanned the broken window, the dark doorway behind Ethan, the still forest beyond the cabin. Snow fell thick around them now. The storm was growing heavier. You know, Brogan said slowly, I've been wanting this moment a long time. Ethan didn't answer. 6 years earlier, he had dragged Silas Brogan out of a saloon in Cheyenne after a bloody gunfight. Brogan had sworn that day he would repay the favor. The outlaw stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. You should have stayed retired, Walker. Maybe. Brogan tilted his head. So where are they? Ethan met his eyes. Who? The woman and the children. Ethan's expression didn't change. Brogan's smile faded slightly. You're not a stupid man, he said quietly. You know why we're here. Behind Brogan, one of the riders shifted uneasily. Boss, the man muttered. Storm's getting worse. Brogan ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Ethan. You hand over the papers, Brogan said, and this ends peacefully. Ethan shook his head once. You're not the peaceful type. Brogan sighed. Still stubborn. Then he raised the torch slightly. Last chance. Ethan's grip tightened on the Winchester. Snow blew sideways across the clearing. The storm howled through the pines. Then Ethan spoke quietly. They're gone. Brogan's eyes narrowed. What? Woman and kids. Ethan nodded toward the forest behind the cabin. Left 5 minutes ago. One of the riders swore under his breath. Brogan turned sharply toward the dark tree line. You lying to me, Walker? Ethan said nothing. For a moment, Brogan studied him. Then he laughed. Maybe you're telling the truth. His voice grew colder. But that just means you're useless to me now. The outlaw raised his hand. The rifles around the clearing lifted. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the 6 men, then back to Brogan. Still afraid to do your own shooting? Ethan asked. The insult hung in the air. One of the riders chuckled nervously. Brogan's smile vanished. Slowly, he handed the torch to one of his men. Then he stepped forward. His hand dropped to the revolver at his hip. Always liked you, Walker, he said quietly, but not enough to leave you alive. For a moment the storm seemed to pause. Snow drifted through the lantern light. 2 men stood facing each other in the frozen clearing. Then, both guns moved at once. The shot cracked through the mountains like thunder. Brogan staggered backward. His revolver fired wildly into the snow. Ethan's rifle smoke drifted into the wind. Brogan collapsed to one knee, clutching his chest. The other riders shouted in shock. Ethan swung the rifle toward them instantly. Drop the guns. For a moment, no one moved. Then one rider lowered his rifle slowly. Another followed. They had been hired guns, but none of them had expected their leader to fall in the first second. Brogan coughed harshly, blood staining the snow beneath him. You always were faster, he rasped. Ethan walked forward carefully. The outlaw looked up at him. You think this ends it? Ethan's voice was steady. For you it does. Brogan laughed weakly. You still don't understand. His breath came shallow now. Men behind this, they'll never stop. Ethan looked down at him calmly. They will when the rope tightens. Brogan's eyes dimmed slightly. The storm continued to fall. Then the outlaw slumped forward into the snow. The clearing fell silent. Ethan looked at the remaining riders. You can ride out of here, he said, or you can try your luck. No one answered. Within seconds, the men mounted their horses and disappeared into the storm. They had no reason to die for a dead man. Ethan watched them vanish into the darkness. Then he turned toward the forest behind the cabin. For a moment, he simply listened. The storm had erased most sounds. But then, a faint voice. Ethan. He stepped toward the trees. Mary emerged slowly from the darkness, Lucy wrapped in her arms and Samuel clutching her coat. The boy still held the small wooden horse. Mary looked past Ethan toward the clearing. She saw Brogan's body lying in the snow, the abandoned torches, the empty clearing. Her voice trembled. Is it over? Ethan nodded once. Yes. Mary closed her eyes briefly. The tension she had carried for days finally left her shoulders. Samuel stepped forward. You beat them? Ethan gave a faint smile. Looks that way. The boy grinned. Lucy clung sleepily to her mother's shoulder. Morning began to creep slowly across the eastern sky. The storm was finally beginning to weaken. A pale gray light spread across the mountains. 3 days later, the small town of Silver Creek buzzed with whispers. A federal marshal sat behind a heavy desk inside the courthouse, studying the documents Mary Caldwell had carried across the mountains. His expression grew darker with each page. These signatures, he muttered. Mary nodded. My husband found them. The marshal looked up. And the men chasing you? Ethan leaned against the wall beside the window. One won't be chasing anyone again. The marshal closed the folder slowly. Well, Mrs. Caldwell, he stood. I believe a great many powerful men are about to have very bad mornings. Mary exhaled slowly. For the first time since her husband died, hope returned to her eyes. Chapter 2 weeks later, the snow began melting in the mountains. Spring crept slowly across the high country. At the small cabin deep in the forest, smoke once again rose from the chimney. Inside, Ethan sat carving quietly beside the stove. Samuel leaned over the table, watching closely. You gonna make another horse? The boy asked. Ethan chuckled. Maybe something bigger this time. Lucy ran across the floor, chasing a wooden toy wagon. Mary stood near the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The mountains no longer felt like a place of fear. They felt like home. She turned toward Ethan. You saved our lives. Ethan shrugged lightly. Just slowed down some bad men. Mary smiled softly. Sometimes that's the same thing. Outside, the snow melted slowly beneath the warm spring sun, and the lonely cabin in the mountains wasn't lonely anymore.